Hey there, it's Justin. In this one, I'm going to be breaking down how to use the built-in Django signals. That is pre-save, post-save, stuff like that. Now, it's actually pretty simple of a concept, but before we jump into it, I want to just illustrate a use case that really lends itself well to Django signals, and that is welcoming brand new users, right? So you have this new service and you're like, I want to send them a welcome. Hey, thanks for being here. Appreciate it. Something like that. Now, when a user actually signs up, well, where do they sign up? Well, probably on a view, and there's probably a form rendered there. So those are a couple options of where you can actually send that welcome email. But that actually falls apart when we go into the admin. Like, what if I added a user in the admin or in a different view? Then I got to rewrite all that logic and repeat myself. That's not good. Instead, what you can do is use a signal. So every time a model is created, you have the option to handle that event in some way, and we do that using signals. So the user is created right before it's saved into the database, a signal sent, and then right after it's saved to the database, a signal sent, right before it's deleted from the database, a signal sent, and so on, right? There's a lot of really cool things about that. So that's what we want to break down in this one. It's going to be fairly basic as far as how these things work, but I do recommend that you have some familiarity with Django and actually building models already prior to jumping into this one. Otherwise, you're going to be incredibly confused. So let's go ahead and jump in. All right, so before we actually implement signals and receiver functions, let's actually take a look at a very common use case inside of a Django project. And that is, of course, creating and saving data in the database. I'm using the user model in this case, but you can use any model that you have inside of Django that's also in your database. So what's happening here? So when we call the model.objects.create, what happens is a signal is automatically sent called pre-save. And with this, it actually sends the instance itself. We'll see this in code in a moment. Now, there's also another one after it's saved, and this is called post-save. It will send the instance as well, also a flag called created. Now, in this case, the user.objects.create, is it going to be a created instance? Is it a new field in the database or a new row in the database? The answer is true, right? So every single time, these two things will be sent. Now the pre-save, well, there are some caveats to the pre-save on create, which I'll get into in a moment. The next thing is we can actually take this instance and save it again. And you might be wondering, hey, do these things get sent again? Well, absolutely, literally every single time. So this now, the post save is now a false, right? So what we can do is we can actually take what this data is and put it into my handler or some sort of function that handles these things, right? They're not always the same, but this is actually my receiver, right? It's a receiver function that we'll end up doing. So this is kind of the idea, but it's not just for save. There's other things that we can do as well. So instance.delete. This also has another kind of signal, and that is pre-delete and post-delete. So the idea here is that it will send various arguments that are related to that kind of signal. Now, all of this stuff is really clear in the Django documentation. So if you look for Django signals, often you'll come to this page and you'll see the various very common signals that we did. We just talked about the pre-save and post-save, pre-delete and post-delete. So if we actually look at any one of these signals individually, we can see the things that are automatically being sent here. We're going to see this in code in just a moment, but you see pre-delete, post-delete has these things. And if we go to pre-save and post-save, we see the instance and created, right? I wanted to make it very clear that these are the things that are automatically going to be sent when we run these different methods. And of course, if we use a different model, it's going to use that different model as well. So the instance itself will always be of this class. Now it does start to get a little bit more complicated when we try to go into many-to-many fields. This is something I'm not going to be covering in this one. Just going to be focusing on the pre-save and post-save, because that hopefully will clear up a lot of issues that you might be having with signals themselves. But if you understand where we're at so far, then I think you're ready for the next step, which is actually handling these signals. Now let's go ahead and turn these examples into real code inside of a models.py. Now this is actually the best place to handle signals inside of a models.py inside of an app that is also in your installed apps, and it has the migrations. You've done all of those things already. Now we're actually ready to handle one of these signals. Now, it actually doesn't matter where you use these signals, and I'll explain why in a moment. But what we want to start out with is the post-save signal. So the import is from django.db.models.signals. This has always been the import, but it's certainly possible that this can change over time. But the signals, this concept is not going to change. It's always going to be there. So this is what we're going to start with. You can ignore this receiver for just a moment, but what we want to do here is actually handle the event that a user has just been created. So I'm going to call this my user created handler. Okay. And I'm not going to put any arguments yet. I'm just going to go ahead and say pass. And now what I'm going to do is actually connect my user model to this handler. There's actually two ways to do it. First off, we can do post_save.connect. So that is the actual signal itself .connect, and then the receiver function we want to use. This is this function right here, and then the actual sender of the signal, as in we are connecting to a specific model that we want to send this signal. And this could be literally any model on literally any models.py, right? So I can run this over and over again, but now that I have this handler, I can do what I want with it. But the question, of course, is what are the args and what are the keyword args? Or more specifically, what are the arguments that are automatically going to be passed to this handler? Before we get there, though, there is this decorator of django.dispatch.receiver. This actually is another way to write this exact same thing. So you can actually use a decorator and pass in the actual sender itself as well as the signal itself. So the signal comes first and then the sender comes second. So these two things are doing the exact same thing. I often use this one so I don't have to remember to import the receiver function, the receiver decorator that is. But I think this is actually a little bit cleaner overall. You'll see this a lot more on really modern third-party packages that use signals. But anyway, so now that we've got this, we have our connected signal. So let's actually see that. I'm going to go ahead and print out args and keyword args here. And I'm going to make sure my server is running. In this case, I have it in my terminal here. It is running. I already have the admin. I already have all that stuff set up. So what I'm going to do is go into my users and I'm going to create another user. So this is a live user ABC12. I probably need to actually give a decent password or something. Maybe not, but I will add one just so it validates. Okay, cool. So I now just created that user. Let's jump into our terminal. And what do you know here? Here are all of the arguments that are coming through here. So notice they are not just positional arguments. They are actually keyword arguments in here. So we've got the signal itself, right? So a model signal. We've got sender. Okay, so that's the user. We have the instance, the actual user instance, whether or not it's been created, right? The flag for created and all that. Pretty cool. And also pretty simple. Now, if you go into the documentation, it shows you all of these things. These are the arguments that are sent with this signal. So most of the time, what you'll often see is it's set up this way. So sender, instance, and created. That's it, right? So this is where we could now have the flag of if created, print, I'll go ahead and say send email to, and then user.username, right? So now after it's created, then we're going to send that email, okay? If it's not created, so we can say else in here, obviously. I'll just go ahead and say user.username was just saved. Okay. Now you might be like, well, wait a minute. User is not defined anywhere in here. Let me break this down. And we see that user is not defined. Well, of course, user is the actual instance because we know it's a class here, right? So it's of the user class. So we know various things about this user. So I can actually just come in here and do something like that. I no longer need to print out the arguments that are coming through. But of course, as you know, all of the additional arguments will be captured by these things. So these are the main ones that we want to have in here. So we'll go ahead and save this. And now what we're going to do is just literally save this live user. This time I'm going to go ahead and put my name as the first name for Justin. Okay, so now I've made some changes. I hit save, and if I scroll down a bit, live user was just saved, right? And if I do it again, let's go back into that user and hit save. Let's go back into any of our users and hit save. We now see that these signals are being sent. This is really cool and really the fundamental part of all of this, which is really nice. Okay, so there is another signal that we definitely want to talk about, and that is pre-save. Okay, so pre-save is a lot like post-save, but different in one major thing, or actually two major things. First off, pre-save does not have this created argument. So created will only be known after it's actually saved in the database. So this, remember, pre-save is, before saved in the database, and then post-save is after saved. I think that's really clear with the name of the signal, but in case it's not, we're going to leave this in here, right? And that's why the pre-save doesn't have this created flag, because it doesn't know if it's saved in the database or not. That actually could fail. You could try to save something in a database and it could fail, absolutely, also depending on what you do here. So one of the other caveats about this is if we print out instance.id, well, this might be none, right? Because you won't get an ID, you won't get that primary key until it's actually created in the database. So let's go ahead and see this. I'll go ahead and say instance.username and instance.id, so we can actually see both of those things in action. If I go to one that I already have, I can save that, and sure enough, I will get both of those things. Oops, we need to make sure that everything is saved and ready to go. Okay, so let's try this again. I'm going to come in here and just hit save and continue editing, and we'll jump back into the terminal. And it's still not printing. Yes. So we want to change the name of this. So user, what I often do is actually the user pre-save receiver, or I'll do just user pre-save. But we'll change both of these to the actual signal it's receiving. Okay, so we save this, and now we're going to go ahead and run this again. Refresh in here, and hit save and continue editing. And now what we'll see is the pre-saved signal. We see that first. It gives me the user and their ID, and then of course that it was just saved. So now what we want to do is create another user, really simply, and I'll say another one, and a whatever password that hopefully passes this. Not matched. Okay, saved, and another one, none, right? So it doesn't actually have an ID, but post-save would. And of course, you could always test that out on your own. So that actually covers the example that we talked about in the beginning, which was how do we actually handle these two things? Now, of course, if we wanted to not use the decorator on the pre-save, we could do that here. Now, before I actually go much further, one of the things that I also want you to note as a caveat is inside of either one of these instances, if I call instance.save, what do you think is going to happen with this? Well, it's actually going to trigger the pre-save as well as the post-save. This happens every time you call instance.save. So if I do this on the pre-save, I'm going to refresh in here, and I'm going to go ahead and hit continue editing. I get a maximum recursion depth exceeded while calling a Python object. What that means is this is recursive. It's literally calling itself save over and over and over again. Okay, so this is something we need to be aware of in any of our signals. The pre-save or the post-save are the most important ones. But the coolest thing about post-save, if you do need to save something in here, what you can do is you can call it in the created instance. So if it's just created, then you can call save and it won't necessarily change a bunch of things, right? It won't actually recall this over and over and over again. So we can actually see this as well. Let's make sure that it's not in here. So let's say don't do this. Okay. And let's go ahead and now create another user. ABC123. There we go. Created another user. And if we look in our terminal, we see that it says no ID. And then we sent that email. Now it says an ID and that it was just saved. So it actually triggered a save twice. So when it was created and then in our signal, we actually resaved it all over again. Okay. So that is generally how all of these signals work. But now let's actually see a little bit more of a practical example with a model that I already have, which is simply blog post. Okay. So going back into the admin, what I want to have happen here is when I create a blog post, I want the slug to automatically be created. Okay. So this is very, very common. Now, what I'm going to do here is add a receiver function here. And this is going to take in the post save. And then the sender is, of course, our blog post here. And then in this case, I'm going to go ahead and do blog_post save. And remember, it takes in sender, instance, and created. And then args and keyword args. Okay, so what I can do in here is say if not instance dot slug, I can do instance dot slug equals to slugify of instance dot title. Now slugify is a built-in feature to Django. If you're not familiar with it, essentially what it does is say this is my title, and it turns it into this is my title, essentially, which we'll see in a moment. So since it's the blog post save signal, we still need to actually save this. So instance.save. Right. So notice it actually won't resave this again because I'm saying, hey, if it's not there, let's go ahead and set it. And now I can save it. Okay. So let's go ahead and try this out. And I'll go ahead and just use something that's already going to be pre-filled in here. And I'll go ahead and hit save and continue editing. I got a little syntax error somewhere. And that is my actual signal itself. So this should be just 1 star to collect those args. I'm going to try and resave this. And sure enough, it actually creates that slug. But this is actually not that efficient because what's happening now is it's going to call save twice. So literally when I create it and then right after I create it, I'm making that slug. So a better option would be to use the pre-save. And the coolest thing about pre-save that I've yet to mention is the fact that I actually don't need to call .save at all. So I can comment out the post-save one. And now what I can do is just run it like this, and that will actually set it for me. I don't need to call save because save is going to be called in just a moment, right? So pre-save happens right before it's actually saved, so I can modify things right in line with that. So let's go ahead and add another blog post here, and microservices are awesome. And now I'll go ahead and hit save, and what I get is, oh, I got a positional argument that, pre-save doesn't have. Well, of course it doesn't. It's this right here. So, this is one of those things that happen when you copy and paste stuff. So now that I've got rid of that, I refresh, hit continue. And now if I come in here, I now see that the slug is created. So that's when you use post-save and pre-save. Now, another example of this would be, hey, notifying users. When would we actually want to notify users of this blog post? Well, this is something that we want to do with some sort of logic, right? And that logic should mean that, yes, the blog post already exists and we want to actually have the ability to update what's going on here. So if we think of this in terms of pre-save, what do we need to know for sure that the model has itself? Well, I want to make sure that if instance.id and instance.notify users, now I'm going to go ahead and print out notify users. And then you also might be able to go ahead and say instance.notify users timestamp we can use timezone.now, which I actually don't have imported, but that would be a way to set that. I'm going to leave that out for a moment. Now, the reason for this is now I actually don't need to do anything because, well, once I notify the users, then we're good. But really, it should be and not, or more specifically, we keep it as an instance notify user. So it has an ID and we are saying, yes, let's notify these users. So in order for this to not be saved over and over again, we actually want to say it as false. Okay. So we want to reset that to being false. So this is a way to actually trigger something in here inside of a pre-save. So now if I refresh in here and hit notify users, I can go ahead and hit save and it's going to be false again, right? So another way to think of this is to now add in that time, the time zone or the timestamp. We can do from Django.utils import the time zone. And what this is going to do is allow us to save that time zone. Okay, so now I can actually save that data based off of this. So I'm going to notify users and hit save and continue. And there we go. We now have a timestamp here. Now, realistically, what would actually happen is you would call like a Celery worker task to offload this. So it's not actually happening in our main request, but it's actually sent somewhere else. So if you want to know more about that, check out the time and tasks 2 project on cfe.sh. So the thing here is we can absolutely do this exact same thing down in the post save method. Now, the reason I actually avoid using post save a lot has to do with the fact that we might call save on accident and run that recursion where it's constantly trying to do this stuff. It's constantly saving and it's constantly having issues with that. So that's one of the reasons that I don't actually call post save that often. It's only more for stuff like this slug itself, right? Potentially, if I wanted to do a bunch of things after the instance was just created, then I would also have that created flag in there too. So pre-save is like my go-to for a lot of signals for stuff like this. But again, with this instance.id, perhaps that's not the best idea, right? Perhaps I want to do it when it's created. Like if I'm writing the blog post and I'm like, hey, I want everyone to know about it right now. In that case, then I would say you would do something more like this and then instance.save. Notice that it won't be recursive. It won't actually keep calling itself because I turned notify users being false, where this block will only execute if notify users is true. But they're actually still very much the same kind of thing. So again, going back to when I would use both of these, this is actually probably how I would end up doing it, which is just like this. I have the pre-save that's building the slug for me. This will happen prior to it being saved for sure. It doesn't rely on the instance. It doesn't rely on the fact that this is absolutely saved in the database. What it relies on is literally just another field that is absolutely required. So you'll get some sense of doing all these things once you do it a lot more yourself in projects. But the idea is you just definitely need to test these things out and just be aware of the fact that if you save it, well, you're going to run into some issues. You can run into issues, I should say. But you should also try to run into those issues. You should try to see how that actually works. So I think you now have a really solid foundation to use pretty much any signal that's built into Django. So let's go ahead and take a look at delete, right? So pre-delete and post-delete. Now these signals themselves are not really any different than what we have here. And the idea is, when would I want to use both of these things? Right, so let's go ahead and copy our other signals from blog post. This time, of course, I'm going to change pre-save to pre-delete and post-save to post-delete. And post-delete, of course, does not have the actual created argument in here. But now we can just see, print instance.id has been removed. Something along those lines. So same thing up here, and will be removed. Cool. So this pre-delete, I might want to move or make a backup of this data, right? So if you, for some reason, don't accidentally want to delete your posts, you can make an entire other model or even the same blog post model and have another field in here saying like, instead of active, you have it as like a backup or something along those lines. Now, I will say that delete is often, if you want to override the delete method, you can absolutely do that right on the instance method itself. But unfortunately, this doesn't always cover every kind of delete. So that is something to keep note of. But if you wanted to do something with this data when it's being deleted or after, this is how you go about doing it. And of course, just like the other signals, we can actually call it directly with postdelete.connect and then the same kind of information that we have up here. All right, so two different ways to do literally the exact same thing. So I actually don't end up using post delete a whole lot unless I'm trying to back things up and I want to keep it where this backed up data is aware, right? The other thing is if you have a manager, for example, and that manager needs to be alerted of something that one of the staff members deleted or at least known about it, you could do that as well. Another thing is with the post delete, perhaps you have a notification you want to send to your user saying like, hey, that giant process that took a really long time to delete was now deleted. So there's another kind of potential option that you could do. In other words, basically taking a celery worker task to do a massive big delete, right? But I think you now know how to implement these things, and I would encourage you to test them out. So I did mention that I'm probably not going to cover many-to-many, but I decided since you're sticking around, you've gone this far, let's actually cover that many-to-many stuff. Now we're going to go ahead and implement the many-to-many field signal. But one of the biggest caveats of this signal is the fact that it can happen on both sides of the equation. It can happen on the actual blog post instance itself, or it can happen on the user instance itself. We are going to be doing it on the blog post side. So when something happens on the blog post instance itself, that's when we'll be handling the signal, not the reverse side, as in where the user is. So this is a little tricky if you're not familiar with how many-to-many fields work, but I'm going to assume that you already are familiar with those things. Even if you're not, you can still see, just generally speaking, how this is implemented. So what's going to happen here is when we go into this model anywhere in our code and we add or change something about a many-to-many field, we want to actually see what happens with that event so we can do all sorts of really cool things. So to do this, I'm going to go ahead and import the m2m changed signal. And then I want to, of course, make a receiver function for handling this. So I'm going to go ahead and add at receiver and sender being blog post, and then define blog post liked changed. So the reason I'm calling it liked changed is because the user liked or something about this many-to-many field is what's going to be changing. So I actually am being incredibly explicit about the field that I'm using. In this case, I just did the entire blog post. That's not accurate. We actually want to use .liked, the actual field itself, and then .through. So this is the way you actually connect that. So whatever the many-to-many field name is, whatever the actual model name is, and then you use .through. That is standard. So in here now, we'll see sender and, well, actually, let's print out the args and keyword args just so you can see what those things are, and then you can pretty much take it from there with the documentation. So let's go ahead and print out args and keyword args. Okay, so now it should be nice and mapped up. So let's go ahead and give this a shot. And right now, I have 2 users on there. Okay, so let's go ahead and comment out those 2 users, and I'm going to go ahead and save it. And I get print takes at most 4 keyword arguments. Oops, I did a mistake. I shouldn't unpack these on the print statement. Oopsies. Okay, so let's go ahead and try that again. Refresh in here. I think that data has already changed, so I'm going to go ahead and run this again. So I'm going to hit save and look back in the terminal. And here we go. Here are all the arguments. Now, granted, they are all keyword arguments, and now we see what's going on. We see the sender, right? So the sender is coming from the liked field, no longer the actual model itself. The action, pre-add, post-add, look at that. You actually have signals for pre-adding to this field and post-adding to this field, much like post-save and pre-save. So the cool thing about that is then in my actions, or rather in this signal receiver itself, we can do sender instance and action. And this we can now go ahead and say if action equals to pre-add, then we can print out was added. Well, what was added? Let's go back into our print statement here. Well, we have the instance, the actual instance of the main class itself, but we also have the related class. So that is the model itself. So this is the user model. That's the related class itself, and the PK set, as in the primary keys that are being changed. Remember, it's many to many, so it's going to be a bunch of different things. So to actually get that data, what I can do here is say query set equals to, well, what's the model that we're going to be using? That's literally this model. So it's quite literally the other model. And I can use keyword args.get of that model .objects.filter and PK, and we'll go ahead and say in, and then this is going to be the actual set itself. So that's the PK set. So again, we can do keyword args.get and PK set, and then I can print out qs.count. Right. So let's go ahead and get rid of these print statements right here. We'll save that, and I'll refresh in here, and we'll go ahead and add just one of them. So just live user. So I now removed some and added some. So let's go ahead and save it. I have no errors, and was added is 1. Okay, so there was the action of remove, right? So if we actually printed out that action, I would have been able to see those ones that I removed as well. So if I refresh in here again and remove a user, add a user, and hit save, I'll now see that all of these things, pre-remove, post-remove, pre-add, was added, all that stuff, post-add, cool. So a number of things that are going on here that are really nice. Number one, this keyword args get. Well, of course, I can actually just declare model and PK set. Then I actually won't have them in the keyword arguments, and I would just use model.objects.all and then PK set like that. But I personally use it like this more often than not because I don't always need the other field. I don't always need the other class. These are the things that I probably always want to be aware of. But it's nice to know that these arguments are in there. And of course, if that context is a little confusing at all, just go into the documentation again and look for the many-to-many changed, and you'll see all of the things that we just went through, right? So reverse, that's the other side of the model, the actual model itself, primary key, all of that stuff. It's all in there. Pretty cool, I think. So that's how you do many-to-many fields. Now, I will challenge you to take this idea and go one step further by using all of the actual signals themselves. So class prepared, pre-init, post-init. Those things aren't a whole lot different than what we did, but it is nice to know that they exist. Now, there are other signals that are cool as well, as in pre-migrate and post-migrate. So when you run your database migrations, you can totally do a lot of those things. And then also the request response signals, those are also kind of cool as well. Now, I actually use the model signals probably the most because of things that I just showed you with the practical implementation of something like notifying the users or actually using the slug and slugifying the instance. Now, I will say the biggest caveat to all of this stuff is you actually don't have to use signals to accomplish all of these things. It's just a really clean and easy way to execute this. The other thing that's important to note is you can actually use signals to do all sorts of cool things. So in this slugify signal, I could totally use other models if I wanted to, like ABC and another one that use that same sort of slug instance itself, right? So this actually allows me to connect to it multiple times on all of these different models. This actually does make your system a little bit more complex and probably harder to follow. So I often don't do this method. So I don't actually recommend that you do either. Most of the time, I'm actually doing it right in line with the model itself. So that model, I know what's going on. But for those of you who are a little bit more advanced, you can absolutely do all of these things as you see fit. The other thing that's really cool is creating your own custom signals yourself. So that actually isn't that hard either, and it does handle the things the same way, but it is nice to have something that you can now broadcast these messages across everything. Hey, thanks so much for watching this one. Hopefully you got a lot out of it. Now, if you liked this deep dive into this Django concept, let me know in the comments other concepts you want me to dive into, whether it's Django, React, Python, JavaScript, Electron, TensorFlow, whatever it is, let me know in the comments and we'll see about another deep dive in the future. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.